My name is Elias Marran. Fisherman, son of a fisherman, grandson of a fisherman. My family's bones are buried no more than a stone's throw from the waterline. And I reckon mine will join them someday, though not for the reasons they did. I was born on the coast, in a settlement so small you won't find it on any map. We called it Breakwater Cove, though in truth, there was no breakwater left, just ruins of old-world stone crumbling into the surf. It wasn't much. A cluster of shacks, a rickety pier, a tavern where the floorboards sang louder than the fiddlers. But for us, it was home. Life by the shore was never easy, not even before the troubles began. The sea gave, but it also took. Nets came up heavy some days, empty others. Salt air rotted wood faster than we could mend it. Children grew up with calloused hands from pulling ropes and skin browned by sun and brine. We fought storms, we patched boats, we learned the sea's moods as best we could, and still, she often surprised us. But we stayed. Because in a wasteland where the land itself can kill you, the sea was a rare mercy. Fish enough to fill bellies, crabs and clams enough to trade inland. Seaweed dried for soup, salt harvested from flats when the tide retreated. A community built not on what we dreamed of, but on what we could endure. I knew the rhythm of it better than I knew the sound of my own heartbeat. Dawn brought gulls crying overhead, the stink of low tide, the creak of boats easing into the surf. Afternoon meant hauling in nets, mending lines, scraping barnacles from hulls. Evenings were for smokehouses, for salted catch, for children chasing each other barefoot across the sand while their mothers warned of broken shells. Nights? Nights were quiet, save for the endless roll of waves and the whistle of wind through ruined stone. That rhythm was life, predictable, bearable, comforting in its own hard way. But no rhythm lasts forever. Not here. Before the first true signs, there were whispers. Stories told at tavern tables after too much ale, passed down from sailors who claimed to have seen things in the water at night, claws the size of shovels breaking the surface, eyes glowing faintly beneath the waves. A screech that carried farther than the gulls, rattling across the shallows when the moon was thin. Most dismissed them as drunken tales. We had our share of strange catches, sure, fish with too many eyes, crabs fused with twisted shells, things half skeletal and half living. The sea had been sick since the bombs fell. Everyone knew that. But monsters? Queens of the deep? Those were stories for scaring children away from swimming too far. Still, the older folks shifted uneasily when the tales were told. My father among them. He'd grown up on the water long before I had, and his eyes had seen more storms than I'll ever weather. Whenever someone mentioned Mirelurks, he'd spit into the fire and say nothing. That silence weighed more heavily than words ever could. Back then, I thought little of it. The sea was harsh, but it was ours. It had always been ours. We were fishermen, sons and daughters of the tide, and no beast could change that. At least that's what I told myself. Looking back now, I realize how blind we were. The sea does not belong to us. It never did. We were tenants, squatters clinging to her edge, tolerated so long as we did not overstep. And when the debt came due, she sent collectors. Not storms, not raiders. Something worse. Something older. Something born of radiation and salt, risen from the ocean floor with claws like scythes and shells harder than stone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is, when life begins by the shore, you grow used to hardship. You measure yourself not by what you conquer, but by what you endure. Hunger, salt sores, storms that scatter your catch and break your mast, that was the life I knew. The life I thought I would die living. The first time I ever set sail alone, I was 12. My father's hands guided mine as we tied knots, as we read the current by the tilt of the gulls, as we pulled in nets heavy with wriggling catch. The sea gives, he told me. Respect her, and she'll feed you. Forget her strength, and she'll take you. I thought I understood then. I didn't. Not truly. Not until the day the sea sent her monsters to remind us who was master and who was prey. But that story doesn't begin with monsters. It begins with us. With Breakwater Cove. With the laughter of children chasing gulls. With nets straining under the weight of cod and bass. With my father's calloused hands steering the tiller. My mother's salted fish drying in the smokehouse. My own hands pulling ropes rougher than any tool. It begins with peace. And peace out here is nothing more than the quiet before the tide turns. The sea has always carried stories. Sailors and fishermen are liars by trade, or so the inland folks say. Maybe they're right. Spend long enough staring at the horizon, and your mind starts filling it with shapes, shadows, and monsters. By the time you stumble back to shore with salt in your beard and rum in your veins, those shapes become legends. In Breakwater Cove, we had our own collection of sea tales. Ghost ships drifting under moonlight, their sails made of stitched-together skin. Sirens whose songs could still hearts before waves claimed them. A storm that was said to follow one unlucky fisherman wherever he sailed. But none of those stories lingered the way the whispers of Mirelurks did. I remember the first time I heard the word spoken in earnest. I was maybe 15, just old enough to haul nets without someone looking over my shoulder. Old man Harlan sat by the tavern fire, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. His face was leathered from years of sun, his eyes pale as driftwood. He leaned close and said it like a secret. Saw one myself. Crawled out of the water quiet as a shadow. Shell bigger than a Brahmin cart, claws snapping the dock posts clean through. We laughed. We always laughed at Harlan. He had a story for every scar on his arms and every ache in his bones. But he didn't laugh with us. He only spat into the fire and stared into the flames as if remembering something too sharp to put into words. That was when I first felt it. That uneasy twist in my gut. The thought that maybe this wasn't just a story. Others began to share their own accounts, though always in hushed tones. Nets shredded as if by blades. Catches pulled up half-eaten, slick with slime. Shadows seen under moonlight, too large to be ordinary crabs or fish. And sometimes, worst of all, the sound. A low, guttural screech that carried across the tide, echoing off ruined stone and black water. The older folk never joined these conversations. They kept their silence, faces set, as if speaking the word Mirelurk aloud might call them closer. My father especially. Every time the name was spoken, his jaw tightened and his eyes drifted to the horizon. I asked him once what he thought, and he shook his head. "The sea gives, boy," he said. "But she don't give without teeth." That was all. No more, no less. The whispers spread, but so did denial. Most of us didn't want to believe. We had our routines, our lives tied to the tide. To admit that monsters lurked beneath the waves was to admit that our way of life might already be doomed. And so, we laughed. We called them stories for children. We told ourselves the sea was ours, and we'd always find a way to wrestle food from her depths. But in the dark corners of taverns, when the mugs were empty and the lanterns burned low, no one laughed. Not then. I'll never forget the night I first heard the screech myself. I was hauling nets late, further out than I should have been. The moon thin and crooked above me. The sea was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that makes you listen harder. And then it came. A sound like no gull, no storm, no creature I'd ever heard. Deep, guttural, half growl and half scream, carrying clear across the water. It rattled through the boat's hull, settled in my bones. My hands froze on the rope. For a moment I thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, louder, closer. I didn't wait to see what made it. I cut the net loose and rowed harder than I ever had in my life. My arms burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop until the pier came into sight. Even then, I swore I felt something moving in the water behind me, just beneath the surface. Watching, waiting. When I told the others, some scoffed. Others looked away, and the old men muttered into their mugs, unwilling to say what they knew. But I knew what I'd heard. That sound was not of this world. It was something older, something patient, something that belonged to the sea long before we dared set nets in her waters. After that night, I started noticing more. Fish vanished from waters that had always teemed with life. Crabs scuttled inland, abandoning the shore. Even the gulls grew quiet on certain nights, circling high above the surf but never landing. The sea itself seemed restless, as though warning us. The whispers grew into warnings. "They're nesting," someone whispered one night in the tavern. "Queens drive them inland when they breed." Another swore he'd seen eggs the size of barrels washed up on the sand, slick and pulsing. A third claimed a cousin's settlement down the coast had been emptied overnight. No bodies left, just claw marks and churned earth where homes once stood. Were these tales true? I couldn't say. But each story added another stone to the weight in my chest. And each time I asked my father, he said nothing. Just stared at the horizon, his jaw tight, as though waiting for something he'd long feared to finally arrive. In Breakwater Cove, we carried on. We cast our nets, we mended our boats, we salted our catch. But every splash in the dark, every groan of the tide against the pilings carried new meaning. Every creak of the docks made us stiffen. And when the wind shifted just right, and that guttural screech rolled across the water, no one laughed anymore. That was how the whispers became truth. Not all at once, not with a single sighting or a single scream, but with 100 small warnings that stacked one atop the other until we could no longer deny what we already knew. Something was out there. Something watching. Something waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it came ashore. The sea does not keep her secrets forever. She whispers, then she warns, and finally, she shows. And when she does, it is never gentle. The first true signs came quietly, almost too quiet for us to notice. At least that's what we told ourselves. Looking back, the warnings were plain as day. We just didn't want to see them. It began with the Brahmin. Breakwater Cove wasn't much for herding. The sea gave us most of what we needed. But a few families kept Brahmin on the grassy flats behind the dunes. Hardy creatures, more stubborn than they were smart. They'd graze all day and lumber back to their pens at dusk without much prompting. But one morning, 3 of them didn't come back. The family thought raiders had taken them. Or maybe the creatures had wandered too far and broken a leg in the rocks. We sent a search party into the dunes, then into the marsh. No raiders, no bones, just tracks, deep, clawed impressions in the mud, half washed by the tide. I still remember crouching by those marks, my fingers brushing the grooves. Too wide for dogs, too deep for deer, too precise for anything we'd ever hunted. They pointed inland, then vanished where the marsh turned soft and the water swallowed the trail. We told ourselves it was nothing. An animal, a freak beast washed ashore. The wasteland was full of them. That's what we said, and that's what we tried to believe. But in our hearts, we knew. The next sign came in our nets. One by one, the fishermen started hauling in strange catches. Not fish, not really. Carcasses half-eaten, scales shredded, eyes missing. Nets ripped as though knives had passed through them. More than once, we pulled them up empty. The floats bobbing aimless on the surface, the rope ends chewed ragged instead of cut clean. I remember one morning when I hauled my net and nearly dropped it back overboard. Inside was a fish, or what had once been a fish. Its body was torn in half, guts spilling like seaweed, its head sheared clean with a single snap. Not a bite, not ragged tearing. A snap, sharp and merciless like the break of a branch. My stomach turned. I tossed it back into the water, watching the waves close over it. But the image never left me. I still see it when I shut my eyes. Not the fish, but the precision of it. The certainty. Predators leave signatures, and this one's was unmistakable. Claws. Soon after, the boats began to suffer. First, it was the smaller craft. Dinghies left tied at dock, found capsized in the morning, their hulls scarred with gouges. Then it was the larger ones, the fishing vessels with patched sails and weathered planks. We found splinters along the shore, ropes torn loose, and waterlogged timbers drifting in the shallows. One night, I woke to shouting. Men ran down to the pier with torches, waving them frantically at the water. By the time I reached them, the sea had swallowed the last of a skiff. The lantern still floated, casting its weak glow across the foam before sinking slowly out of sight. We searched for survivors until dawn. We found none. That was when the whispers stopped being stories. Folk no longer spoke of Mirelurks as legends. They spoke of them as fact. And not just Mirelurks, queens. That word began to creep into our voices, sharp and bitter as seawater. We didn't know what it meant, not fully, but we knew enough to fear it. The oldest among us muttered about nests, that Mirelurks did not wander aimlessly, that when they came ashore in numbers, it meant a nest was close. And if a nest was close, then a queen was never far. We wanted to deny it, but how could we, when the signs kept piling? I remember one afternoon when children came running from the dunes, their faces pale, their voices shaking. They had found something washed ashore, a shell, larger than any crab they'd ever seen. We gathered to look. The thing lay half buried in the sand, slick with salt and seaweed. Its edges were jagged, its surface scarred, and its weight took 3 men to lift. It wasn't just a shell. It was a piece of armor, shed or broken off something too large for our minds to comfortably accept. The children stared wide-eyed. The adults said little. My father stood over it longest, his face tight, his hand running along the grooves as though memorizing them. When I asked him what it meant, he gave the same answer as always. The sea has teeth. But his voice broke when he said it. From then on, nights in Breakwater Cove were not the same. No one slept easily. Nets were cast closer to shore. Lanterns burned later. Dogs howled more often. And every splash, every groan of the tide carried a weight it hadn't before. We were fishermen. We lived by the sea, and we had always accepted her moods. But this was different. This was not a storm to weather or a current to ride. This was something alive, something that watched us as surely as we watched the waterline. The first signs had come. Livestock gone, nets shredded, boats overturned, shells too large to explain. And deep in our bones, though we never said it aloud, we all knew what it meant. The sea was not just warning us anymore. She was sending her children ashore. The first time we saw them, truly saw them, was a night the sea refused to stay quiet. The day had been calm, too calm. The kind of day where the gulls circled restlessly and the waves rolled low and heavy, as though something beneath was holding them back. The air itself tasted strange, metallic, as though the salt carried rust. My father muttered that it was a bad tide, though he wouldn't say more. That night, the water boiled. We heard it first. Not the crash of waves, but the churn of surf, as though dozens of bodies were thrashing just below the surface. Dogs barked. Nets trembled where they hung from poles. The tavern door flew open, men spilling into the street with lanterns raised high. I was among them, my hands shaking as I clutched a rusted harpoon. And then they came. Figures broke from the surf, crawling on claws sharp enough to carve through stone. Their shells glistened in the lantern light, slick with seawater and streaked with algae. Their eyes glowed faintly, unblinking, catching the firelight as they scuttled forward. Mirelurks, not stories, not whispers. Flesh and shell and claw, dragging themselves from the ocean's belly to our doorstep. The first struck the pier. Wood splintered as claws tore through beams older than I was. Lanterns swung wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the water. Shouts rose. Gunfire cracked. A few rifles, their bullets sparking harmlessly off armored shells. The creatures did not falter. They came in a tide, dozens of them, their screeches blending with the crash of waves. They smashed into boats tied at the dock, tearing hulls apart like toys. Nets left to dry were shredded in an instant. Crates of salted fish were overturned, their contents devoured as though the catch had been nothing more than bait. We fought, though fight is too kind a word. We flailed. We fired rifles that did little more than chip shells. We swung harpoons, axes, whatever we had at hand. Some blows struck true, piercing softer flesh where joints met. When one fell, two more took its place. I remember the sound most of all, the screeching, high and guttural, echoing through the cove until it seemed the night itself was crying out. My ears rang with it. My chest tightened. Fear clawed harder than any shell could. But we did not run. Breakwater Cove was our home, and when the sea rose to swallow it, we met her teeth with whatever courage we could muster. The fight raged until dawn. By then the beach was littered with broken crates, shattered wood, and blood, ours and theirs alike. The Mirelurks retreated as the sky lightened, slipping back into the surf with unnatural grace, as if the night itself had been their ally. We stood panting on the pier, bodies trembling, weapons slick in our hands. We had survived. Barely. But it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the attacks grew bolder. Mirelurks came in smaller groups, testing us, gnawing at the edges of our defenses. They tore apart traps set along the shoreline. They scuttled into the marsh at night, vanishing before we could track them. Nets cast in the shallows came back with more holes than fish. Every encounter chipped away at us, not just in losses, but in spirit. I'll never forget when one of the younger boys, barely more than a child, went missing. He'd been sent to gather driftwood along the beach. We found what was left of the basket he carried. We never found him. From that day, no child walked the shore alone. The laughter of barefoot games and splashing feet vanished. The beach became forbidden ground, haunted by glowing eyes that lurked just out of sight. The elders muttered about the Queen, that these were her children, scouts sent ahead to soften us before she came herself. No one spoke her name loudly, but we all felt her presence like a shadow over the tide. The Queen. Even saying the word made my skin crawl. If these creatures, claws like cleavers, shells like iron, were merely her children, what did that make her? I asked my father once, his face lined with exhaustion after another sleepless night of watch. He didn't answer at first. He only stared at the horizon, lips pressed tight. Finally, he said, "A storm you can't outrow." I didn't understand then, not fully, but I would. Soon enough. For now, it was the children we faced. Night after night, raid after raid, claws raking against wood and stone, glowing eyes flashing in the dark. We patched holes, we rebuilt docks, we buried our dead. And every morning, as the sea calmed, we knew it was only a pause, only a breath before the tide returned. It wore on us. Men grew hollow-eyed, staring at the surf as if waiting for it to rise up and swallow them. Women clutched their children tighter, whispering prayers to gods long forgotten. Some spoke of leaving, abandoning the cove. But most of us knew the truth. There was nowhere to run. Inland was no safer, and the sea had always been our lifeline. So we stayed. We endured. Because that's what fishermen do. We endure storms. We endure hunger. And now, we endured the Queen's children. But endurance has limits. And the sea, I realized, was testing ours. The night it truly began was lit by a thin moon and the glow of our lanterns. The Queen's children had tested us for weeks, but that night, they came in numbers no fisherman's spear could match. We called it a raid, though that word feels too small for what it was. Raiders take what they want and leave. This was different. This was the sea itself rising to tear us apart, driven not by greed, but by instinct, by the will of something older and hungrier than us. It began with silence. The gulls had vanished days before, flying inland and never returning. The dogs refused to go near the shore, tails tucked, hackles raised at the slightest sound. Even the waves seemed to hush, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. I was on watch that night, standing with a harpoon at the edge of the pier. My father beside me, lantern in his hand, his jaws set tight. Around us, others kept their own vigil, rifles loaded, axes sharpened, every man and woman waiting for the tide to make its move. When it came all at once. The water boiled, just as it had before. But this time the surface broke in dozens of places at once. Mirelurks surged forward, their shells catching the lantern light, their claws snapping with a sound like cracking bones. "Steady!" my father shouted, though his voice cracked on the word. The first volley came from our rifles. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off shells, but some found softer joints, eyes, legs, the gaps beneath their armor. A few creatures dropped, screeching, but the tide didn't falter. If anything, it surged harder, the swarm driving toward the pier with terrible unity. Then they hit. The front ranks smashed into the pilings, claws tearing through wood as if it were driftwood. Boats tied at dock were torn apart, their hulls shattering under the onslaught. Fishermen swung axes, spears, harpoons, shouting curses that were swallowed by the screeches. I thrust my harpoon into the joint of a Mirelurk's claw, felt it sink deep, and yanked it free just in time to dodge a swipe that split the railing beside me. My father drove his spear into another, grunting as its weight nearly pulled him into the water. The night became a blur of motion and sound. Lanterns swinging wildly, gunfire cracking, claws raking across wood and flesh alike. The air stank of salt and blood, the piers slick beneath our feet. And still, they came. From the surf, from the marsh, from every shadow the tide could hide. Their screeches rose higher, a chorus of hunger and rage that drowned out our shouts. For every one we dropped, two more clawed their way forward. The fight spilled into the town. Mirelurks smashed through the outer shacks, tearing down walls, sending families fleeing into the square. Mothers clutched children, fathers swung axes with desperate strength. Fires broke out where lanterns fell, their glow casting the battle in hellish light. I remember the moment one of them broke into the tavern. The door splintered, men and women scrambling for cover as the beast scuttled across the floor, claws raking deep gouges into the boards. Someone hurled a lantern, flames blooming across its shell. It screeched and thrashed, crashing into tables before stumbling back into the street, smoke rising from its armor. It wasn't enough. By midnight, we were fighting for survival, not victory. The pier was gone, the boats shattered, the streets torn and slick. Bodies lay among the wreckage. Friends, neighbors, men I had laughed with just days before. I fought until my arms ached, until my hands blistered around the harpoon shaft, until every breath burned in my chest. And still, they came. I thought we would all die there, swallowed by the tide. But as suddenly as it began, it ended. The screeches faltered. The Mirelurks slowed. One by one they turned, retreating back into the surf. Their armored backs slipped beneath the waves, their glowing eyes vanishing into the dark. We stood in stunned silence, our weapons still raised, waiting for another wave. None came. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the groans of the wounded. Dawn revealed the truth. Breakwater Cove was broken. Half the pier lay in splinters. 3 boats had been dragged into the sea, never to return. Shacks along the shore were flattened, their contents scattered across the sand. And among it all, bodies. Too many bodies. We buried them that day, the graves shallow, the earth still wet with salt water. No one spoke much. Words felt empty, useless against what we had seen. But in the silence, a question lingered, unspoken but heavy in every glance, every clenched jaw. Why had they stopped? The attacks before had been tests, we thought. This raid should have been the end of us, and yet just when the tide could have swallowed us whole, it receded, as though something unseen had called them back. That was when the whispers began again. Not of Mirelurks, not of nests, but of the Queen. That she was out there, just beyond the surf, watching. That this raid had not been meant to finish us, but to weaken us, to break our walls, our spirits, our faith. That the children had come because their mother willed it. We did not want to believe it. But as I stood on the beach, staring at the waterline, I felt it. A presence, a weight, as though the sea itself was breathing just beyond my sight. The raid had taken friends, boats, homes. But worse than that, it had taken our certainty. We no longer asked if the Queen was real, only when she would rise. The raid had left us ragged, broken in body and spirit. But the sea wasn't done. No. She had only sent her children first, to test us, to soften us, to bleed us of strength and hope. The true terror waited until the night the Queen herself came ashore. It began with a sound. Not the screech of the Mirelurks, not the crash of waves. This was deeper, heavier, like the grinding of stone against stone. It rolled through the water, rattled the windows, and set every dog howling in unison. I was jolted awake by it, my heart already hammering before I even understood why. Then the tide rose. Not the usual rhythm of waves, but a surge that flooded the beach in seconds, sweeping away crates and barrels we had stacked as barricades. Fires sputtered and died as seawater rushed through the lower streets. And then we saw her. She rose from the surf like a nightmare given flesh, a mountain of shell and claw and rage. Twice the height of any house. Her bulk eclipsed the moonlight, casting half the cove into shadow. Her shell gleamed slick with seawater, ridged and jagged, like the rusted hull of some old-world battleship dredged from the deep. The Queen. Her roar shook the air, a sound so deep it rattled my bones. It wasn't a scream like her children's. It was command. Dominion. As if the ocean itself had chosen a voice, and this was it. Her children came with her, dozens of them pouring from the waves at her feet, but it was her presence that froze us. I had thought myself hardened after weeks of fighting Mirelurks. I had faced claws and screeches and death in the night, but nothing prepared me for the sight of her. We fired. Rifles cracked, their flashes lighting the night. Spears and harpoons flew, whistling through the air before striking her shell with dull, useless thuds. The Queen lumbered forward, undeterred, each step shaking the ground, leaving deep craters in the sand. A house near the shore was the first to fall. She slammed into it with a claw, tearing through wood and stone as though it were driftwood. The roof caved, walls collapsed, and the family inside barely escaped, their screams swallowed by the roar of the tide. We scrambled like ants, trying to mount some kind of defense. Fires were lit, torches hurled onto her shell. Flames licked across her armor, but did little more than cast her in hellish light. Explosives, crude powder kegs we had hoarded, were rolled down the slope and ignited. The blasts shook the air, shattering windows, splintering wood, sending smoke billowing across the cove. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The Queen reeled, her screech rattling the air, her massive body staggering. But then she straightened, shook the flames from her shell, and advanced again. She was not just a beast. She was inevitability. Her children tore through the streets, snapping at any who stood in their way. We fought them as best we could, harpoons sinking into joints, axes breaking claws, rifles firing until the barrels steamed. But every man locked in battle with a Mirelurk was one less to face the Queen. And she kept coming. I remember the moment she reached the tavern, the heart of Breakwater Cove, the place where our stories were told, where laughter once rang. She slammed a claw down, the roof exploding in splinters. Lanterns shattered, flames erupting in a wave. The tavern that had stood for generations burned in seconds, swallowed by her fury. I froze. My legs wanted to run, but something in me refused. This was more than survival now. This was the fight for Breakwater Cove's very soul. My father stood beside me, his spear gripped tight, his face set in grim resolve. He looked at me once, just once, and nodded. A wordless command, a father's last gift. We joined the others in hurling what remained of our powder kegs. This time, we didn't aim for her shell. We aimed for the ground beneath her, for the sand and stone of the shore itself. The blasts shook the beach, sending sprays of sand and seawater into the air. The Queen staggered, one massive leg sinking deep into the crater. She roared, thrashing, her children screeching in response. For the first time, she slowed. "Now!" someone shouted. We surged forward, spears and harpoons raised. Men swarmed her trapped leg, jabbing into softer flesh, striking at the joints. She thrashed, swatting bodies aside like insects. But enough of us pressed forward that she bellowed in pain. Another blast, one final keg, rolled beneath her bulk. The explosion sent fire and smoke billowing, the shockwave knocking me flat on the sand. When the haze cleared, the Queen was retreating. Step by step, she pulled herself free, roaring fury into the night. Her children followed, scuttling back into the surf, dragging their wounded with them. The tide boiled once more, then stilled, leaving only silence and smoke behind. We had survived. Barely. The cove was in ruins, the tavern gone, boats splintered, homes collapsed, bodies strewn across sand and street alike. The air stank of smoke and blood and salt. We stood among it all, battered, broken, too numb to even cheer. We had driven her back, but not defeated her, not destroyed her. And that was worse, because now we knew what waited just beyond the waves. Not a story, not whispers, not shadows in the surf. A queen, a force of nature, a storm you could not outrow. And she would return. After the Queen came, nothing in Breakwater Cove was the same. We had seen her with our own eyes, her bulk rising from the surf, her roar shaking the sand, her claws tearing through homes. You don't forget a sight like that. You don't laugh it off in taverns or dismiss it as drunken talk. You carry it in your bones. And we carried it every day after. The cove became a settlement under siege, though no wall or barricade could truly protect us. Still, we tried. Men scavenged driftwood and old-world beams, shoring up houses with planks thicker than we'd ever used before. Nets weren't just for fishing anymore. We stretched them across the shallows, weighted with stones, hoping they might slow the Mirelurks if they returned. Watch posts were built along the dunes, manned day and night. Fires burned on the beach as a warning line, their smoke drifting inland in dark columns. Children were forbidden from the shore, their laughter replaced by whispers and wide-eyed stares at the surf. The sea, once our lifeline, became the enemy we watched with suspicion. Every creak of the pier, every splash in the night, set nerves on edge. The Queen's roar echoed in our memories, and even when the tide was calm, we half expected to hear it again. Fishing changed too. We no longer dared to sail far from shore. Nets were cast in shallow waters, though the catch was smaller, weaker, sometimes barely enough to feed us. The bigger hauls were left to rot in deeper waters, claimed by the monsters that lurked there. We grew hungry. Meals shrank to thin broth, scraps of salted fish, seaweed gathered from the flats. We chewed more than we swallowed, tricking our stomachs into believing they were full. Some left the cove entirely, striking inland to trade or seek safer ground. Few returned. Those who did came back with empty hands and hollow eyes. And always, the sea watched. There were nights when the water boiled again, not with the Queen, but with her children. They didn't storm the town as before, not in full. They lingered at the edge of lantern light, claws snapping, screeches echoing. A reminder, a warning, a promise. We stood watch with rifles and spears, torches in hand, too afraid to sleep. They would scuttle back into the surf at dawn, leaving nothing but churned sand and claw marks in their wake. The waiting was worse than the fighting. Fighting, at least, gives you something to do. A place to put your fear, a way to spend it like coin. Waiting only feeds it. It grows, festers, until it seeps into every word, every glance, every breath. I saw it in my neighbors. Men who once laughed loudly at the tavern now spoke in hushed tones. Women who once sang while gutting fish now fell silent, eyes darting to the windows. Children clutched rag dolls and wooden boats as if they could ward off monsters. Sleep became rare. When it came, it was broken by nightmares. The Queen rising from the surf, claws raking through walls, eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. More than once, I woke to the sound of someone screaming in their sleep, only to find my own throat raw from the same. Breakwater Cove was alive, but it was no longer living. We endured, as fishermen always do. But this was not endurance. This was survival, with no end in sight. I began to notice changes in myself, too. My hands, once steady on the ropes, trembled when I held the harpoon. My eyes, once fixed on the horizon, flinched at every ripple in the water. And my thoughts, once filled with nets and tides, now circled endlessly around the same truth. She would return. We all knew it. The Queen was not finished. She had tested us, tasted us, torn at our walls. She had seen that we were not strong enough to kill her, not united enough to defy her. She had pulled back not in defeat, but in patience. And patience, I realized, was the most terrifying weapon of all. For weeks, we lived under that shadow. Days of hunger, nights of dread, always waiting for the roar that would shake us again. Every sunrise felt borrowed. Every tide felt like a countdown. Some broke under the weight of it. I saw families pack what little they had and vanish inland, though most of us knew it was only trading one danger for another. Raiders, rad storms, starvation. The wasteland has no shortage of ways to finish you. At least here by the sea, we understood the enemy, or thought we did. Others clung harder than ever to the cove, their fear twisting into stubbornness. "This is our home," they said. "The sea is ours. We'll outlast her." They built their walls higher, sharpened their spears, and swore they'd fight until the last plank burned. But deep down, we all knew the truth. Walls and spears meant little against a storm that walked on legs. I remember one night, sitting with my father on the ruined pier, the waves lapping at the posts. The moon was bright, the sea calm, almost beautiful. Almost. I asked him if we could ever win. If a queen could be killed, if men like us could stand against something born of radiation and salt. He didn't answer right away. He only stared at the horizon, his hands folded, his face weathered and tired. Finally, he said, "Storms end, boy. but not because of us. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't hope. It was truth, spoken plain. From then on, I understood. We weren't living anymore. We were waiting for the Queen's return, waiting for the storm we couldn't outrow, waiting for the sea to collect what she believed was hers. That was life in Breakwater Cove after the Queen rose. Not peace, not war. Just siege. An endless siege by the ocean itself, and we were only ever tenants on her shore. Fear is a tide. At first it laps at your feet. Then it creeps higher, soaking your legs. Before long it pulls you under, and you don't even notice you're drowning. That's what happened to Breakwater Cove. We thought we were hardened folk, bound together by rope and salt and blood. But the Queen had shown us what we were up against, and fear gnawed at us like rust on iron. Soon the cracks began to show. The first were small. Arguments over watch duty, over rationing fish too thin to fill a stomach, over whether a keg of powder should be saved for defense or spent patching broken tools. Tensions that would have blown over in better days festered in the shadow of the Queen. Every decision carried weight. Every disagreement felt like a spark over dry tinder. Then came the superstitions. It started with offerings. Small things at first. A string of beads left on the beach, a loaf of bread set carefully at the water's edge. I saw a woman kneel at dawn, whispering into the surf as she pushed a clay figure into the tide. When I asked what she was doing, she said only, "The Queen must be appeased." More followed. Coins, carvings, dried fish, all left on the sand where the waves could take them. Some said it was an old world practice, something their grandparents had spoken of. Others swore it was the only reason we were still alive, that the Queen's retreat had been mercy, bought with gifts. I didn't believe it, but part of me wondered. When the sea itself feels alive, it's hard not to think it might have ears. Others, though, saw the offerings as betrayal. "We don't bow to monsters," they shouted. "We fight!" Men who had lost sons or brothers in the raid spat on the gifts, kicked them back from the shore, daring the sea to come take more. Fists flew in the square more than once, neighbors turning on neighbors, grief twisting into anger. My father said nothing. He only watched, his face carved with lines deeper than ever, as though he'd aged years in weeks. When I asked him what he thought, he muttered, "Division feeds her better than any offering." And he was right. The cove splintered into factions. Those who believed in appeasing the Queen, they kept to themselves, whispering prayers, leaving offerings, glaring at anyone who mocked them. Those who believed in defiance grew louder, angrier, swearing we could kill her if we just fought harder, built better weapons, struck first instead of waiting. Caught between them were the rest of us, too tired, too hungry, too afraid to pick a side. We just wanted to live another day. But the Queen didn't need to lift a claw to weaken us. We were doing it ourselves. I remember one night in particular when a storm rolled in from the east. Not the Queen, just a storm, though it was hard to tell the difference anymore. The wind howled, the waves crashed against the pier, lightning split the sky. In the tavern, folk gathered, arguing over whether it was a sign. "An omen," one man said, slamming his fist on the table. "She's angry. We didn't give enough." "Fool," another shouted. "She doesn't care for trinkets. She cares for blood. If we strike first, the woman beside him snapped. "You saw her. Strike her, and we're all dead." Voices rose, chairs scraped, hands clenched into fists. My father stood and roared for silence, the sound cutting through the chaos. For a moment, the room stilled. Then the thunder outside swallowed his words, and the arguing began again. That was when I realized. The Queen didn't need to tear us apart. Fear would do it for her. Superstition grew darker as hunger gnawed harder. Some whispered of sacrifices, not just offerings of bread or beads, but lives. A goat, a Brahmin, a dog. And if those weren't enough, some didn't say it outright, but their eyes told the story well enough. I tried not to believe they meant it. I tried to tell myself we were still human, still neighbors, still a community. But when fear grips tight, when hunger claws at your belly, when the shadow of something too big to fight hangs over you, humanity frays. Not everyone gave in. Some still clung to reason, building defenses, scavenging powder, training with spears. But even they couldn't silence the whispers that slithered through the streets at night, carried on the salt wind. The children heard them too. I saw it in their eyes, wide and fearful, clutching their dolls tighter when someone shouted about sacrifices, hiding behind their mothers when men cursed each other in the square. The sea had stolen their laughter long ago. Now, it was stealing their innocence. One morning, I found a group of children leaving small shells on the sand, their hands trembling, their eyes darting to the waves. They weren't playing. They were pleading. It broke something in me, because children shouldn't have to beg monsters for mercy. But that was Breakwater Cove now. Not a town, not a community, a settlement cracking under its own fear. The Queen hadn't struck again, not yet. But in her absence, she had still conquered us. And every day, I wondered which would break first, our walls, our bodies, or our minds. The Queen gave us weeks. Weeks to starve, to argue, to fracture. Weeks to wonder whether she was gone, whether we had bought mercy with our offerings or our blood. Weeks to pretend the silence meant safety. It wasn't mercy. It was patience. And when she returned, she came not as a shadow in the surf, but as a storm that walked ashore. It was night again. It was always night when she came. The moon was high, the tide swollen, the air heavy with that same metallic taste I had felt before. My skin prickled before I even heard her, before the sea began to churn. Deep down, my body knew. We all knew. The first sign was the screech of her children. Louder this time, hundreds of voices echoing across the waves. Lanterns flared along the shore as men scrambled to their posts. Rifles were raised, spears hefted, powder kegs rolled into place. We had prepared as best we could every night since the first raid. But preparation is no shield against inevitability. Then the water erupted. The swarm poured forth more than we had ever seen. Mirelurks by the dozens, then by the hundreds, their shells gleaming like wet stone, their claws snapping in unison. They surged onto the beach, into the shallows, up the streets. The sound of their screeches filled the night, drowning out the crash of waves and the thunder of rifles. And behind them, she rose. The Queen. Larger than before, or perhaps she had always been that large, and now my terror allowed me to see her fully. Her bulk loomed over the rooftops, her claws carving deep furrows in the sand as she lumbered forward. Each step shook the ground, rattling lanterns, toppling weak walls. Her roar thundered across the cove, a sound that silenced even her children for a heartbeat. The battle was chaos. Powder kegs ignited, explosions lighting the night in fire and smoke. Mirelurks shrieked as shrapnel tore into their softer joints. But the swarm pressed forward, unstoppable. Spears found targets, harpoons sank deep, rifles cracked until barrels glowed. For every one that fell, 3 more scuttled over its corpse. I fought with a harpoon in my hands, my arms aching, my body screaming for rest. I drove the tip, into claws, into eyes, into any gap I could find. I slipped in blood, mine, theirs. I couldn't tell. Around me, neighbors screamed, some in rage, others in agony. The queen moved among it all, like a god of ruin. She tore through homes, flattening them with sweeps of her claws. She shattered barricades as though they were toys. Her roar drowned out every cry, every prayer. She was not merely attacking us. She was unmaking us. We struck at her as best we could. Powder kegs hurled beneath her bulk. Flames lit across her shell, men swarmed her legs, stabbing at joints, hacking at gaps. She bellowed, the sound rattling the very ground. But she did not fall. I saw my father then, his face set in grim determination, spear in hand. He charged with a group of others, driving their weapons into the soft underside of her claw. She thrashed, sending men flying like rag dolls. My father was among them. He did not rise again. Something broke in me then. Fear, grief, I cannot say. My arms moved on their own, driving the harpoon again and again into the nearest creature, my voice raw with a scream I did not hear. The town was fire and ruin. The tavern, rebuilt in part after the first raid, collapsed in flames. The pier was gone entirely, splintered into the tide. Homes lay in pieces, their contents strewn across the sand. And still, we fought. Not for victory, we knew better, but for survival, for one more breath, for one more heartbeat. At last, a final explosion shook the beach. The last of our powder kegs, dragged beneath the queen by desperate hands, ignited in a blast that lit the sky brighter than lightning. The shockwave knocked me flat, the roar of fire mixing with the queen's scream. When the smoke cleared, she was retreating. Wounded, yes. Blackened scorch marks scarred her shell, ichor oozed from her joints. But not slain, never slain. She pulled back into the surf, her children retreating with her, dragging the dead and the broken alike. The sea swallowed her bulk, her roar fading into the depths. And then there was silence. Breakwater Cove was no more. What remained was ruin. Smoldering fires, shattered homes, streets slick with blood. Too many gone, too many broken. Those of us left stood in stunned silence, weapons limp in our hands, unable to believe we were still breathing. We had survived. Again. But survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like prolonging the inevitable. Because the queen was not gone. She had pulled back once more, as she always did, patient, waiting. And we knew, all of us knew, she would return. Not tomorrow, not next week, but someday. And when she did, she would not stop. The second coming had proven what we had feared all along. You cannot kill a storm. You can only endure it. And storms always return. My name is Elias Marran, fisherman, son of Breakwater Cove, survivor, though I no longer know if that word carries any meaning. I speak now not to tell you how we lived, but how we died. For Breakwater Cove is gone. Not all at once, not swallowed in a single night, but piece by piece, tide by tide, until nothing remained but wreckage and memory. The queen did not destroy us in a moment. She wore us down. She broke our nets, sank our boats, starved our bellies. She turned our nights into vigils, our days into arguments, our prayers into whispers to the sea. She taught us to fear not just her claws, but her silence. And when she came, she reminded us that the ocean is not ours to claim. It never was. We were tenants, squatting on her shore. We thought the sea gave freely because we worked hard, because we respected her, because our fathers and grandfathers had hauled nets in the same waters. But the sea does not care for respect. The sea does not care for labor. The sea takes back what she pleases, and she sends monsters to collect her due. That is the truth we learned too late. I have seen her. I have seen the Queen rise from the surf, a mountain of shell and rage, her roar shaking the very earth. I have seen her children swarm over homes, their claws tearing through wood and flesh alike. I have seen fire, blood, ruin, and worse. I have seen the way fear breaks men before claws ever reach them. I carry those sights with me. I carry my father's face, lit by firelight, his final charge ending beneath her shadow. I carry the screams of neighbors as their homes collapsed, the silence of children who no longer dared to laugh. I carry the stench of smoke and salt, the sound of waves closing over the wreckage. These are the scars she left behind, not on my skin, but in my soul. I tell you this not because I seek pity. Pity is as useless as prayer before the tide. I tell you this because there are other coves, other towns, other fishermen who look at the sea and see only bounty, who cast their nets without thought, who build their lives on sand and salt, who believe the ocean can be tamed. Hear me now. It cannot. The Mirelurks are not just beasts. They are not accidents of radiation or freaks of nature to be hunted and mounted on walls. They are the sea's reminder that humanity is not master here. They are her soldiers, her collectors, her children. And the queens? The queens are storms given flesh. You cannot fight a storm. You cannot reason with it. You cannot bribe it with trinkets or appease it with prayers. You can only endure it or be swept away. Breakwater Cove endured as long as it could. We fought with spears, with powder, with fire. We rebuilt, we resisted, we prayed, we bled. And still, the sea took us back. Now I stand alone, a fisherman with no nets, no pier, no home. The cove lies in ruins behind me, the tide already erasing the last of our footprints. Soon, no one will know we were ever there, no one but the sea, and she does not forget. So I give you this warning. When you live by the shore, do not mistake the ocean's gifts for kindness. Every fish in your net, every clam in your basket, every drop of water you drink from her wells, all of it is borrowed. All of it must be repaid. And when the debt comes due, she will send the Queen. Her children will rise from the surf, claws snapping, shells gleaming. They will swarm your streets, shatter your homes, silence your laughter. And then she will come, her bulk blotting out the moon, her roar drowning out your prayers. She will remind you, as she reminded us, that the sea does not serve man. It claims him. So remember this, if nothing else. The sea provides, yes, but it always takes back. And when it does, it sends the Queen to collect the debt.